You're listening to Tune Dig, a conversation between two lifelong friends about the power of music, one album at a time. I'm Cliff Seal.
And I'm Kyle Stapleton. Each episode, we talk about a single album in depth, unpacking it through conversation to understand what makes it worth appreciating, and learning a little bit about life along the way.
If you're listening for the first time because we're covering an artist or a record you love, we promise you'll learn something new or gain a new perspective by the end of the episode.
And if you've stuck with us for multiple episodes, you know by now that you're bound to expand your horizons as we share clear entry points for artists you may never have tried to get into before.
Today we're talking about This Is Why by Paramore.
What happens when you leave a young mall emo punk band in water and let them absorb it over 20 years? Do they become large like the gummy bears trick and the dinosaurs of my youth? Or do they just become waterlogged and weird? Find out this episode on Tune Dig.
For me, it's more like, what happens if you stop looking at a band that is playing shows in the rec rooms of churches and you turn your back and become a tax-paying adult, and then you turn back around and they're like the Talking Heads, and you're like, when did this happen? I feel like such a weird cosmic connection to this band, but like not in the ways that I feel like I usually talk about on this podcast. I was pretty sure for a long time that I did not like Paramore. I didn't have strong feelings one way. I wasn't like, I hate Paramore. Like, Paramore sucks. I was never one of those people. Like, realize they made good pop songs and a lot of people like them, and that's cool. And I'm happy to tell the story of the first time I realized that they were going to be famous. But I was just sort of like, man, not for me. But I feel a connection because they're from Franklin, Tennessee, and they grew up in the same general oppressive vice of evangelicalism that we did. Southern church hardcore kids. And it's just blossomed into this whole other thing that, to me, when you listen to this album, is utterly undeniable. So I think the headspace that I'm approaching this conversation with is, it's me, I'm hater. Because like, people I have found have really strong opinions about this band, which is kind of intense.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just one of those, like, it's there, you can take or leave it. There's much more offensive fare out there, and this is solid. So like, what's your beef? Part of it may just be part and parcel. There's like an ungodly amount of ink on this band. Like, there's so much written about them every album cycle. A lot of it is sort of the same. A lot of the criticism tends to be dramatic and meddling, and at different points in their career they certainly haven't helped that perception. But here we are, like roughly 20 years in, with like a mature, realized statement. And I'm starting to wonder if we're making some selections subconsciously as like dudes approaching their 40s. We're not doing a lot of first albums. You know what I mean? We're not doing a lot of early career stuff lately. And I don't think we're trying to do anything like that. But we've always kind of done that, actually. Like, we didn't pick Zeppelin 1. We didn't pick Southern Playalistic. Maybe we're just not debut album guys, even though there's so many good debut albums.
Well, certainly out of the discography, while I have an affinity for it that I'll express several times, we'll make it real clear why we didn't pick the original album on this one.
All We Know Is Falling? Is that the name of the...
Heck yeah, man. Yes. And
yeah, that's some real on Cliff's iPod, not Kyle's shit.
It's such a really specific moment in time, to your point. Like, our relationship to this artist is inherently different than most of the other ones that we cover, because in so many other cases we're trying to catch up on a history that we weren't a part of, whereas like Paramore is a time machine that we can put ourselves in, and we're so close to the general age of that band anyway that their moments are at least recognizable as milestones in our own life, for sure. But yeah, I mean, All We Know Is Falling, I knew 100% was like, I knew that album was getting dropped. I was following Fueled by Ramen, and like, I remember I was living in New York at that time in 2005 in the summer, and this CD dropped, and I quite literally listened to it and started then listening to it after buying it, because back in the day we bought the music and then we could listen to it after that. And I mean, this got picked up at the same time that As I Lay Dying and the Red Chords Clients. This was the bundle of things that I picked up at the record store.
Oh my God. When we're talking about Fueled by Ramen, what are we talking about? Fall Out Boy.
Yeah.
Early like Yellow Card. I'm trying to think of like what were the bands for you that were Fueled by Ramen bands that put that label on your radar?
I mean, mostly just this one at the time. Trying to think back to some of the artists who were around back then. But I mean, Gym Class Heroes, Fall Out Boy, The Academy Is, Panic at the Disco. These were bands that got really big and surfing a similar wave that, you know, Paramore would end up not only creating, but then resurfing again later in their many genre changes. But I didn't give a shit about any of these other bands. Paramore was a standout to me because they were adjacent to the emerging-ish post-hardcore, post-emo thing that was kind of happening at the moment, where hardcore guitars could still be a part of what some of these bands were doing. Whereas, you know, a lot of the other bands started going, which we'll talk about because it was, you know, heavily inspiring the album we're actually talking about now. But dance rock and dance punk and all that went off in a very specific direction that a lot of bands followed. And for a little while, Paramore was in this little group with a handful of others that were interesting melodically, while still really clearly having this sort of pop punk affinity and appreciation for other artists that were sort of in that scene to begin with. So to me, this was the little pocket. And I got excited about this band specifically from hearing the singles on MySpace.
My man.
But I mean, I was even up on the lore. Like, I knew in 2005 that the shadow you see on the album cover on the sofa is the band member that left just before the album came out. And it was like a whole representative thing, and would then connect to, like, you know, actually they ended up changing another album cover on purpose later on as a band in like 2013 or something to like make a statement. Like, so they've always kind of been playing around with this, but have always been just interesting enough to catch my attention ever since then. And to me, that's probably the story of every genre shift that they've gone through since they started existing. And the album we'll talk about today is likely my favorite, but I mean, my second favorite is that first not super great one, because it had so much energy and was interesting and just clicked in at a time where music discovery for both of us was just sort of exploding.
Yeah.
Like, that was right after I got my 60 gig iPod Color, and I was on top of the world.
And we were walking around as independent young adults in the open world environment, and there was always music around that time. So yeah, we were like in peak discovery mode.
Yep.
Or I thought at the time I'm doing better at discovery than I ever have in my life. And I never would have thought that would have been the case pushing 40, but here we are. My Paramore discovery was a girl that we grew up with wanted to go see this band that I was aware of. I think because of you, or like you and sort of like the crew from high school. And it was at the Mask, and it was a weeknight, and there were not that many people there. It was in Heaven at the old Mask, and they came out and played some songs. It was like, this is cool. And then they were like, we're going to play a new song, and it was Misery Business. And within 30 seconds of that song, I was like, this band is going to play arenas. This band's going to be fucking huge. You just knew that was a thing. It was about to be a moment. And then the next time they came back to Atlanta, I think they sold out the Tab, and it was all up and up from there, and they stayed there. But I remember just like being aggressively not interested because the choices between that moment and just generally being like, this vibe's not really from, like, it's not edgy enough, whatever. That was a me thing, not a them thing. The moments between that and the next time that I got interested, which was In It Fun, was like Haley did the song with B.O.B. that I hated so much. That airplane song. And then
let's
they did
play that here.
Can we pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars? I
Yeah, it's fine by me. I never listen to these episodes after we release them. So we're just making other people miserable. Maybe they love it. I don't know. Maybe that's also a me thing. But then it was also, they did a song for the Twilight soundtrack. And I was like, no, absolutely not. And it had the video where they were in the woods doing the whole shtick, and it was just like, pass. And then it was a couple more years and they put out the self-titled, and Ain't It Fun came on the radio, and I didn't know it was them. But it was like the radio out in public somewhere, because this is 2013 and you're like not listening to the radio in your car anymore. And I remember being like, man, who is this? This is good. This is like a New Jack Swing song. And then it turns out it was Paramore, and I was like, oh no.
What are you gonna do when the world don't orbit around you? So what are you gonna do when the world don't orbit around you? Ain't it fun?
And then I've been 1 foot in ever since. But I was like a singles guy. It's like, okay, I get why the big song is the big song for them right now, with like Still Into You and then Hard Time, like other stuff later. But this is the first time that I was like, you know what? I'm going to really give the record a go, because the first single came out, the title track, and it just like blew my doors off. Like, maybe this record will be really good. And here we are.
I'm sure we'll mention as we go along the ways that their various evolutions as an act and as a band maybe mirror or look a little bit, if you squint hard enough, like some of our own moments in life. But I think maybe just saying right up front, I love that you went ahead and expressed that idea of your sort of nope, okay about Paramore for you. Because I think like out of the 3 to 6 shifts in genre and in approach that you might want to call out about this band, even with all of the accolade and sort of widespread love that we'll talk about for this band that exists, you're still likely to find in every Paramore fan an album or two that's pretty nope. Like, well, okay. And, you know, for me, that was Misery Business and Riot.
Mm-hmm.
I wished them well. And maybe we'll talk some more about this, but like my favorite Paramore song by far is the last song on their first record, called My Heart. And it's pretty simple and boneheaded, but just like for a mid-aughts pop hardcore band, there was little that could match the like emotional intensity of sort of doing something anthemic that they did, and they shoved it right there at the end of the record. And we'll mention the end of this record that we're talking about as well. But getting all the way to the last song and being like, well, this one's my favorite, was extremely reminiscent of about 20 years ago, picking up that album and saying, all right, I really like the singles. There's some strong work on these other songs. Oh, and this last one is my favorite by far. This is something cool that I haven't heard anyone else do. I just want to go ahead and call out, you know, me and you both have some pretty high and low moments with relation to this band, and everyone else should feel comfortable having that too. And so this is definitely, I think, one of those episodes where let's invite you back in, especially if this is an artist that you've sort of knocked off or dismissed, either if you used to like them, never really thought you'd like them. There's probably something in this journey that might catch your attention, even if it's not the record we're talking about today. But out of all of them, I think the record we're talking about today is the best front door to this band and what they're capable of now, because it's such a culmination of them learning how to exist as a unit, even with, you know, so many of the individual people rotating in and out over those different years.
Totally agree. I think it is objectively the best music that they have made, and it's the best sounding record. And it's so hard to do good closers. It's so hard to be a band that backloads stuff. The only other band that like I think about as a closer band, the last track on the record just really crushes it and makes you want to start it over immediately, is He Is Legend, which is like there's a lot of similarities in the sort of like cultural atmosphere that they were raised in. I don't think that has anything to do with closers, but I would be interested for anyone to write in and say who's your favorite closers band. The only other one that I can think of is Zeppelin. I don't think anybody does closers better than Zeppelin. Like When the Levee Breaks is the ultimate album closer. This Is Why, 6th album by this band, which is, again, crazy to even think about that any band survives past 3. But this band, that we've been around long enough that we were there at the inception, and they now have 6 records, released in February of 2023 on Atlantic Records, their final studio album obligation to Atlantic, as part of a 20-year contract that Haley signed as a solo artist at age 14. They allege that was the first 360 deal ever, which is an interesting tidbit. But like, just to contextualize that, at that time, having discovered Haley Williams, they were looking for an also ran in the vein of Avril Lavigne or Kelly Clarkson or Ashley Simpson, or like kind of a rocker chick doing pop with a rocker posture or clothing. And now here we are with like sort of a different thing entirely. This record debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. It won 2 Grammys for Best Rock Album and Best Alternative Music Performance for the title track. And then they took it out as the opener for Taylor Swift's Eras Tour in stadiums. It's big. There are very few records and bands that are like this big and permeating in the public consciousness. Not normally the world we live in as listeners.
And I think to underscore why we will mention this band's debut record and the stuff that was happening 20 years ago is the attempt to capture Haley Williams as a solo act, and her sort of rejection of that played out over these 20 years. And I think allowed them to evolve in the ways that they had, because she could have very easily made her money. It's hard to express how easy it would have been, relatively speaking, for her to get in, get out with a music career and kind of continue to do whatever it is she wanted to do. And there was and continues to be an insistence that she's a part of an act, even though now we have actual solo records from her. That was an insistence on her part. And I think also, though, maps this really interesting, like I said, we sort of have this time machine in this band that we can ride along with. And like, it's worth mentioning that, yes, she signed what is effectively the first 360 deal ever as a 14-year-old, knowing basically nothing. But also at that moment in time, it's hard to express a moment to people who weren't literally there for it. But Taylor Swift didn't.
He wasn't
used
in
to
the
be.
gym.
Yeah. Oh, this is even greater intro than, yeah. Taylor Swift was not always some sort of like godlike show me what you got figure in the cosmic sky. She used to be a kid who was making mid country music and putting it on MySpace. Her and Haley Williams were around one another and were, much closer friends at that time. I don't really know or honestly give a shit about their adult friendship nowadays, but it's worth pointing out, like, those two people were around each other at the Nashville scene at a time where effectively the music industry was starting to figure out, once again, well, how are we going to use and possibly exploit women for the next 5, 10, and 20 years and try to make them into particular artists. And here you see two paths diverge in the woods, both of them coming from Nashville and ending up country into abject pop. And then now here, this sort of like pseudo emo hot topic punk thing that has now gone in and through dance and whatever might come next out of this particular band too.
I mean, Taylor Swift is such an interesting foil for thinking about this band and Haley. And like, I don't want to necessarily say that anytime there's been an opportunity to take the cred fork in the road that she's done it, I don't necessarily think that's true. But, thinking about Paramore, like Nirvana and how that was like what Kurt was doing and so torn up about doing over and over and over again every time they had a chance. Like, do I sell out? Do I do whatever? I think she's forged about the most credible path possible to be as big a band as they are. For a long time, Misery Business and stuff aside, I thought of Hayley Williams as the chick on the Chariot record. One of my favorite, I think both of our favorite records from the year that Riot came out was The Fiancé by the Chariot from Douglasville, Georgia. The reason that this podcast exists started with a debate about a Chariot record. I was like, put that back on the record. And I don't know anybody else in the world has gotten Josh Scoghan's name in print, let alone the New York Times, talking about influences and putting him on a list of frontmen alongside Elvis and Freddie Mercury as her influences. And like, she didn't have to do that. She could have been big Christina Aguilera pop star, but there's always been, call it punk rock guilt or whatever. There's always been a thing like keeping her grounded and in the band and whatever. And all of that really shines through in the trying to make sort of a therapized adult version of what they've been doing in this record here. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Between the Chariot and the Me Without You, love and support in the mid-aughts. I would say that is the other thing that was sort of bringing Paramore into my sphere, at least. Like this band's cool with me, honestly, because of the way that they talk about and support other bands and the way that they're trying to, especially at that moment in time, and this will probably keep coming up as we talk about this record because it's such a part of this band's journey. But if I were to try to encapsulate what was happening in the mid 2000s for kids who grew up in overly evangelical Southern Baptist situations, like the Chariot and Me Without You literally and specifically represented these sort of escape hatches for a lot of us because they were two sides of a coin that both represented an honest sense of authenticity about music. The Chariot being as absolutely almost ridiculous, with lack of a better term, as they could possibly be with music, just deconstructing whatever hardcore and metal even meant at that time, and then laying sort of poetry on top of it. Right on the inverted side of that was Me Without You, which we have a whole episode that we don't have to rehash necessarily, but like I'm going to wear my heart on the outside of my entire body and be as vulnerable as an exposed nerve. Approach to religion and spirituality was the other sort of way that a lot of us could identify with and appreciate. And so to see someone like Hayley Williams and a band like Paramore sitting squarely in between those two, taking a much more conventionally acceptable route and basically pointing in both of those directions and going, but these are my favorite bands.
Yeah.
Like these are the people doing it. Like there was a sense of, I hate calling it a scene, but there was a sense of community that came along with that was really specifically in the South. Atlanta, Nashville, Greenville, Birmingham, and even at that time, we still would have maybe claimed Florida.
Northern and Central Florida,
yeah, as part of all this. And there was something really unique that was happening at that moment. That's part of what forged this band. And so that's not what this album is about, but it certainly is a significant portion of what our relationship to Paramore has been, and especially mine and how I viewed them over the years.
The headline, as I sat and thought about this band, was that, you think about all the changes and whatever. This is a feelings first band. They've been called an emo band or whatever, but they are a band that wears their emotions outwardly without being a capital E emo band, in my estimation.
Yep.
And I think a lot of that does come from a person like Aaron Weiss and learning how to be brave on stage. But I think it's important to really distinguish why a band or a musical artist exists and feels the need to do something, to keep doing this, being in the world, expressing, especially over a long period of time, like 20 years, that's a long time to weather all the slings and arrows of putting yourself out into the world. And so you compare, like, what is your reason for being, okay, to put my feelings out there, versus a music first band to put sounds in the universe, versus an aesthetic first band to like put an artistic vibe or start a movement or something, or a personality driven band, which this could have been with Haley, and to some degree is, but like she's always bristling back up against it, or a political agenda first band like Rage, or like a lot of great, punk bands with the Minor Threats of the world. And not only are they a feelings first band, but they're a band that has grown up in all the ugliest years of your feelings, where you don't know how to process them healthily. And like, people talk about Gen Z growing up on the internet and having to do all their ugly shit publicly. They did that a bit ahead of the wave. Like from 14, 15, 16 on, they've had to share big feelings astronomically publicly way before they were able to have a healthy grasp on them. And so what I love about this record is we see them like doing the work and healing and freeing themselves and not making themselves not culpable. There's a lot of inwardness and accountability, and it's all the things that brought them here, they sort of bring home. And it came at just the right time in my life to like really resonate with the headspace I was in, and ended up catching me by surprise, like how much this record really resonated with me, because I would have gone to my grave thinking I would never put a Paramore album on a year-end list, but it just took like being in sync with the feelings first thing and processing walking an emotional landscape, to use that Björk term we tend to use again and again.
It's winter, so that song plays in my head at all times.
How Scandinavian of you.
I think that's what you just said is a pretty good segue to, let's talk about what surprised us about listening to this record that got hooks in there. Because one of the reasons I was excited to talk about this for sure with you, I mean, sometimes we have similar experiences of records, just we go from 0 to 100, just like, oh, well, this record fucks. Thanks a lot. This rules.
And it's been so much of that for a while, because we've intentionally picked stuff that we were both pretty cold on.
Yeah. And whereas this one is more like, I was surprised that you were surprised by it. I remember when it came out and that you talked about how much you like this record, and then that surprised me. So let's talk about what's surprising about it in general, because maybe that'll catch some other people's attention who wouldn't have otherwise given this a listen, or at the very least can kind of contextualize what's different about this versus what Paramore has done in the past, which I think is part of probably what surprised us.
Yeah. I'm not trying to say that Paramore was not a good, tight band musically. Obviously, that's sort of uncontestable. But the thing that jumped out at me immediately, beyond the fact that this record starts and ends quietly, it's not like, snare hit, jump into the bullshit. It's like musically very good and in a sophisticated way. So my first listen through, I just remember being like, my God, these songs sound really good. Like, this thing is vibing and it's tight. And then I just kept playing it through because it's a short record. It's a lean record. And the thing that kept jumping out at me was how economical it was. There's not a note wasted. There's not a thing out of place. It's layered, but I wouldn't call it lush. It's all so tightly packed in there and nothing's wasted. And that to me, like, is so mature and so hard to do. And you think about your Rick Rubin, capital C creativity, cutting away all the fat to the leanest possible version of the thing and having it tight is so deceptively difficult. And I really felt like they nailed it here, but it came down to the elements. Like, the elements really stand out of the music. So the first thing is, and when you read the interviews, you see them talking about, like, we want to win a Grammy on this record for Zach Farrow, the drummer, who had left the band for years and was asked back by Taylor York, the guitarist. This is a fucking drummer's record. It's hard to be a beat keeper and not be, it's like, anytime you're like, what's a great drummer? And you start thinking of them and listing them, they're choppy, crazy, showy. they're the rhythm equivalent of pick sweepers. But to do a little and be really gentlemanly, the first drummer that like ever really made me think about that was Matt Helders from the Arctic Monkeys.
Yeah.
And you have the same situation here. Zach Farrow is a gentleman drummer, like very tasteful, very tight. And then you listen to it and you're like, that's a fucking impossible rhythm or fill or whatever. And it just feels so casual and done. But it's propulsive and it bends my mind a little more the harder and harder I listen to it. So like the sort of backbeaty thing in the title track is an example. There's a moment in the pre-chorus of The News. All of Figure 8 is a monster drumming song. I know we're going to talk about Thick Skull a lot because it's the last song and you've already pointed that out. There's breaks in the bridge of Thick Skull. And when I was listening really hard on headphones or on my good sound system, it's like, fuck, man, like he is doing the thing. He's on fire. And then you start looking upward from the bass element and the guitar is really cool. And I really want to hear your perspective on not only the drumming, but especially the guitar, like always, because most songs are like introduced by guitar or like start to present themselves through guitar. And I've never really thought of Paramore as a guitar band at all, but a lot of them start with like a tonally strange, like deceptively simple 2-note or 3-note or a bit of a tremolo thing, but it's very hooky. Like You First is probably the example there, the like off time thing. I feel like if you didn't know this was a Paramore record and you closed your eyes and didn't look at streaming, you'd be like, this is a cool art rock band. And you'd want to know about the guitarist and you'd like go look up their Guitar World videos or whatever. And then above those two elements, everything's done really tastefully. I think it's a very tasteful vocal record. Haley's got pipes, but a lot of the stuff is very dynamic and tends to often be subtle. And then there's subtle flourishes throughout, mostly synth and guitar, arpeggios and warbles and synths, and the flute in Big Man Little Dignity that sounds like the Baker Street saxophone lick, but it's flute. And it took me a long time to realize why that moment was so familiar. But there's not a lot of, it's not like the Paul Simon 72 layer thing where you're like, it's supposed to signal sophistication because there's a lot of layers and lushness. There's like one thing or two things, we've talked about before, She by the Misfits being one of the greatest choruses of all time because he only does it once. There's just like not quite enough of anything. And it makes everything so delicious, like omakase type approach to the production.
This is fun. We oftentimes, before we start talking on a podcast episode, try to pre-share our, various experiences listening to it fresh and what stood out and all that. This time we didn't for a couple of reasons, but I was kind of curious to see how our experiences would line up considering we came to it so differently. And what is far away hilarious to me is that the top two things I immediately wrote down were, one, this is a really tight 36-minute record. And that is like in and of itself part of the reason why this piece of music is worth checking out. The word tight works so well here because between the timing, the length of the record, and secondly, the drumming, like they are almost an order of magnitude somehow better in both of those regards than they ever have been as a band.
Yeah.
Which is, again, especially interesting because part of the reason talking about this band's 20-year career, or part of the reason that it's interesting to talk about it, is because several of these members used to be here and then came back.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't necessarily expect this level of evolution from the same drummer who was on the first few records and has now come back in the last two. This is the same drummer. And so to that end, I think those two things together mean, or at least imply, there was some good production work probably being done here. But that also leads me into the thing you teed me up about, and I think is fascinating in a specific way about this record in particular. I got a chance to listen to several interviews. Like you said, like Paramore is a band that has been written about a lot, and they talk about themselves a lot. And I don't mean any of that in a negative or positive way. They're just like very open. They give interviews very consistently. They have across, their entire career. Obviously, while Haley is the only singular person who has remained in the band the entire time, like we've said, like several members have gone and come back. So it's not necessarily just a rotating cast of characters around her. And so to be able to go into an interview and there's a 1 hour interview with the whole band specifically about this album where Zane Lowe is just asking really specific questions as a fan of this album.
It's so good. I mean,
yeah,
he's grown on me over the years, and I have come to really deeply respect him as a person that like puts so much care and preparation into the conversation. Clear fan first, but obviously like a band's band guy. And I watched multiple. I watched the one for After Laughter. I watched the conversation with just Haley for Petals for Armor. And I watched I dropped 3 hours of my life, Scorsese film style, into Zane Lowe interviews. And like the Petals for Armor one is really good because he's on fire, dropping like they're doing therapy talk before, like right before that wave started peaking. And deconstructing some stuff, and he's like making her realize things in real time, and she's going, "Oh shit, dude!" And then he's like making them feel really seen in the "This Is Why" interview, and it's a really good, really good conversation. So just if you like that at all, even if you never listen to this record, if you decide there's still a barrier up for you, like go watch that conversation. It's like reading a 33 and a third book where you're just like, I've gotten insight into the headspace and the vulnerability of an artist, and I feel really good about that. It is a good musical artifact, period.
Yep. All right. Perfect tee up. I'm going to click all the way into exactly what you're saying because it is the thing that made me interested in the guitar work on this album.
Hell yeah.
Okay. We'll try to link these things up as always, but pretty easy to go find the hour-long interview with the Paramore band about specifically This Is Why. Now, about 30 minutes into this interview, Zane gets excited because he's like, I really, really like this one song. I really like
Running Out of Time.
So in the moment I'm talking about, he ends up talking about You First. And he's just going off about it. He's like, it starts off with this little, like the count in on the sticks, all these little things that are slightly unconventional. And then Zane is just like, tell me about this. Like, it feels like it explodes with creativity, basically. And he's just naming specific thing after specific thing. And he talks to Taylor about his guitar parts in this song. And it's really important that, like, if you want to catch what I'm talking about, like, you have to watch the video, because to this end, Taylor, the guitarist that we're in this moment celebrating, he
classic shy guy.
Yes,
by the way, yeah.
You can see him have this fold in on himself moment, and he unveils a little bit and then backs up. So he basically says, oh, actually, I hate that song. And I tried really hard to keep it off the record. This creates this immediate energized response from Zane and even other people in the band. They obviously recognize what he's talking about in this moment. But, Zane is like, why? He's so energized about it. And in that same moment, you can see that same Taylor, guitarist of a huge Grammy award-winning rock band, and it's like he turtle shells, and he just literally says, actually, I need to admit that I have a lot of anxiety in this interview right now. And then everyone in the room turns on to this.
Shifts.
Yeah. So they're like, oh, basically like, why?
Yeah.
Not you shouldn't be, or you should be, but just say more about that. Tell me why you're feeling this way. Hearing him then around that time in the interview start talking about how he gets anxiety because he doesn't want to be asked specific questions about his guitar work, because he didn't feel like he put in, like he was like, first of all, if I knew that song was going to make the album at all, because I tried to fight against it, I would have still redone the guitar parts that ended up there. I don't like them. And he starts talking about how he comes up with these guitar parts, and he sort of emotionally is rejecting the idea that anything he's done has been clever, which is an interesting enough vibe for a guitarist. Because, like, bro, that's free. You're on an interview right now getting told your shit was cool. That's free. Just go, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. But there's too much like honesty and vulnerability and rawness going on for him and them right now for him to even do that. And so he just flips into being vulnerable in front of God and everybody on this YouTube video.
But what's great about it is it's revealed that he's the sort of, and there's one in every band, he's the sort of technical center
Yes.
of the band.
Yeah.
And those elements are really tight and
Yes.
tasteful because he's so introverted and doesn't put too much of anything anywhere, because a lot of that stuff comes from him. And then it turns into a great conversation around, actually, it was very freeing for, I'll just keep working and working and working and working on a thing until it makes me want to kill myself.
Yes.
And then Zach, the drummer, is collaborating with you is great because you'll drive 20 more miles down the road past a good idea. And I'll be like, no, wait, it was this thing. And then they started validating each other. And it was like, oh my God, this is so great. Like, this is the stuff right here.
You picked up on exactly what was exciting me about that. Yeah. Because, and then Taylor would talk about, he expressed at some point in that interview, he was like, I had started packing up my stuff early. He was like, I've literally started putting up my gear because...
and the engineer was like, well, I guess there's no more takes of this song.
Right. But the way he expressed it was like, basically, he played until he was gone. He played until he was absolutely done. And like, the fact that there was vulnerability in the moment that he was being asked about it is, I think, what makes some of these people worth paying attention to. When someone like this makes music and it comes out good, it's worth an extra little, let's try to understand what's going on there. Because another way of saying what he might have said in a more positive headspace is like, I gave this everything I could possibly give it, and it came out this well because I left everything on the floor. Like, by the time I was packing my stuff up, I had no guitar left to play. And the other two members of this band are so good and care about this music so much that became a Grammy award-winning record. Like, even though, again, the guitar parts themselves, they're great, but they're mostly just well produced and thoughtfully and tastefully done, which is exactly what you've said.
Yeah.
There's, like you've pointed out, there are no layers of cleverness to extract here necessarily, maybe with the exception of Figure 8, where the music actually sort of matches what they're doing to a more visceral degree. But the rest of this is just, they're really good. And they're really comfortable with the idea of continuing to write music together, despite emotionally being in this place of not really knowing how to express anything necessarily new or different or even like poignant, if I can kind of say that about the lyrics. Nothing here is necessarily profound so much as like it is felt.
Yeah.
I saw one quote talking a bit about the lyrics and talking about the song The News, but that refrain, turn off the news, and someone's response to it was basically like, it was a whole bunch of people who really liked Paramore. Actually, now that I think about it, it was an article about 4 different folks who were Black who wanted to talk specifically about why they liked Paramore and why they liked this record, which is a phenomenon we will touch base on as well. But one of the responses was like, I love Paramore. I love these songs, but the lyrics to The News aren't really doing it for me. I really don't need to be told by, especially another white person, that we've probably had enough news. And actually that criticism, I could identify with it as someone who has grown alongside this band. Because I got to tell you, in this day and age, I don't have a lot of nuance left either. I'm repeating the same shit that we've been talking about for 20 years because we thought 20 years ago we are staring at the problems that we're going to see resolved in our lifetime. And instead, most of what we've gotten is watching all of those problems rot as the people in charge tell us that they've gotten better. Yeah, exactly.
Do not believe what your eyes are showing you. But the leaving it all in the field bit is interesting when you consider this is on the back of a 5-year hiatus where they had been burnt at that time and just said, like, we need to walk away from this for a while. And then you'd think, okay, we filled our tank all the way back up, but it was still an exercise sort of hesitantly to come back in and find a thing. And it just sounds like it grew and grew and grew until they had this tight little potted plant of a thing. But I also think that huge gap is why you could like this record and potentially not like anything else from this band. Because I remember seeing them perform on Colbert for the single from the previous record, After Laughter. And it was like, I get that Dewey Cox phenomenon, where like, if anything feels like a trope in the arc of an artist's career, it was like, oh, well, they're trying to be mature Paramore now. And, she watched Stop Making Sense once and they're going to be like, this is our thing now. And it's just like goofy costumes and like angular posture, literal posture behavior. And that just felt so artificial to me. Sounds really good. It's cool. They're pushing their sound forward. Cool. Awesome. Good for them. Love the cover art of that record. But like this record feels lived in, they did that. They toured on it maniacally. And then it was like, well, we can be a whole other thing now where we get back to the roots a little, but we take everything that we've had. And the only thing on After Laughter that gave me any indication that something like this record was possible, only in retrospect, because I didn't ever go listen to the record, was in Told You So, the guitar and drum interplay. Again, it's about the really simple band in the room elements here. And then there's a little vocal run Haley does, around the words, "At least I tried."
I know you like when I admit that I was wrong and you were wrong. At least I try to keep my cool when I am thrown into a fire. And let go. I hate to say I told you so.
And it's like, oh, this could have been on the current record. But then thinking about that in the opposite direction, any song, like I didn't hear any traces of early Paramore, kid, teenager Paramore. And the closest any of the record came to that for me was Crave, right toward the end of the record, where it's got the like teenagers at Six Flags sort of sentiment. I never want this day to end. But if that had been on an early Paramore record, it would have been arranged completely differently. So it's just like, they went into a like sci-fi scrambler and they came out themselves in a totally different way. It's like cubist versions of themselves, which is a phenomenon that I find really cool. The pandemic and all the bullshit broke them in a million different directions. And because we're so familiar with the shape they were in at the same time as us a long time ago, seeing them in this shape now is really quite compelling to me.
Yep. And I want to, as we kind of move into artist intent and some things to focus on and isolate and all that about this record, I want to keep kind of building out the divergent ways that this band has impacted our current reality and how they might continue to in the future. Because one thing I definitely want to do, especially for anyone else who is literally our sort of age range, really need to go through and name check a few albums that were coming out in the mid-aughts that like were sort of adjacent to what Paramore was beginning to do in the dance scene and how that was affecting what we were calling punk and even hardcore a little bit at the time. But then also like hopefully something that's already obvious, but loops back into past Tune Dig episodes. And then also for the younger people listening, or if you're someone who has kids, like there's a whole generation, old, mid-range, new Paramore, any of it. Olivia Rodrigo, Willow, a ton of modern artists will point directly back at Paramore and say, that is what I was into when I was younger. And, for us to be into Paramore when we were younger meant being into All We Know Is Falling in 2005 when we're like graduating high school. But instead, shifting your perspective to a younger generation, and then especially women, and then encountering a Paramore that was a few albums deeper than we were. Like, this is the Paramore that they become familiar with, and now has resulted in, like, there are songs on This Is Why that sound like Olivia Rodrigo songs. I mean, just 1-to-1 exact direct, and they're aping each other in the best way possible. And so it's a rare phenomenon to be able to trace a band like this, especially who could have so much impact on different aspects of music scenes as they evolved over so long.
So we collected a few of those, and I think it's worth remarking on none of the attributed quotes are from who you would expect. Who's 10 people that said Paramore was an influence on them? And the list is crazy. Steve Lacy, Odd Future World fame, said Paramore raised me. Lil Uzi Vert said, she's the best of my generation, talking about Hayley Williams. There's nobody else, bro. Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors listed them number 2 in his top 5, alongside Drake, Burna Boy, Wizkid, and Lecrae. One of these things is not like the other. Brendan Yates of Turnstile, who directed the title track video and the Thick Skull video, said Ain't It Fun is one of the best songs of all time. Demi Lovato said, one of my biggest influences, and Hayley is my dream collaboration. Pink Pantheress saw them at Reading 2015, and that was the thing that opened her eyes to the fact that, like, she could be a performer. It gave her a model to look at. Princess Nokia played Misery Business on her Beats One show, and the description in this article says she gave the song and Williams an introduction that was especially emotional as the tone of her voice grew awed and teary. Girl, you changed my life, girl, Nokia said of Williams, recounting Paramore's 2010 Bamboozle set. So, again, for a band that's like huge pop, maybe you think they're pretty prefab, multiple people saying their live experience was raw enough to change my life. She unspooled her praise with total rapture. It says, you came out and you changed everything, girl. You like 4 feet tall and you got a voice that come from the Baptist Church of the South. Where are you from, girl? Tennessee? You definitely from Tennessee, girl. I know you was raised in that church, Miss Honey, Miss Hayley Williams. We're going to have to take a moment and just live for Miss Hayley Williams, Nokia if used, because she really did that. And not for nothing, Elton John said in 2020, I've been a huge fan of Hayley Williams since Paramore started, and it's been on my bucket list to meet her. Elton fucking John, in addition to all those other people. That's like breathless. That's not regular, like, oh, I like those records. That band's cool. That's like, because they're feeling first. I think that is the thing that resonates with other people that so badly want to feel so deeply out in the world, and like, I think feel seen by her and this band because of it. And I appreciated the breathlessness of the praise.
And that praise extends to, this will be fun. We always make sure to hit on these moments in this podcast because this shit actually matters, but both of our shoulders will go up into our ears. There are moments where we have to recognize like impact of specific artists, bands, albums, whatever, on other cultures that are not ours. And it's so monumental that we have to be able to point at it because, one, because that's an amazing phenomenon, but secondly, because when someone has this level of impact, it should put a little notch in your brain that something important is probably happening. And it's worth trying to figure out why and how that all feels like. And to that end, you just listed quite the smorgasbord of human people who like Paramore. But
that's
like,
not a list of artists you're putting sequentially on touch tunes at a bar.
No. Oh God, certainly not. But to map to several things you were just saying, like the phrase "Black people love Paramore" is itself a meme describing how Black people can love unconventional things, well, at least unconventional by people who aren't Black people most of the time, or, you know, by folks who want to overly simplify what a culture is, like there is an awesome podcast called Black Girls Love Paramore. Like
yeah.
it is about the nature of unconventional things being loved by a culture. But like eventually she got to interview Hayley Williams, and like there is, man, in a time like 2025 on planet Earth 838 or whatever it is we are, like to be able to see on YouTube two people sitting down talking about, hey, white girl, you actually did a lot for us. Do you know this? And like, did this occur to you? And like, there's so much to learn about that moment because you can see the authenticity and humility in it. And Paramore as a band, I think, has attracted this sense of universal acclaim because, to your point, they're feelings first, and they're also willing to examine those feelings and change them when needed, right? And I think that itself signals safety and welcomeness to other people. And like on one hand, just relaying stories that I read about, reading articles that were attempting to explain the phenomenon of basically, why were you surprised that Black people love Paramore to begin with? Why is this a thing you need to be surprised by? But sure, we'll explain it to you. And hearing from women that like, hey, well, I grew up in a place where being both a Black girl who also too loved like emo and punk was an isolating experience. Like people made fun of me. It wasn't okay. And in fact, it made me laugh a little bit because one of the Hayley Williams interviews, like she was making the point that like, hey guys, actually like emo became a thing that we laugh at, but like there was a time before it became a commercialized concept where emo was just inherently uncool. The My Chemical Romance polish of things had not come along. And up until then, it was just a bunch of us singing The Moon is Down in baby blue Adidas track jackets, and then everyone else making fun of how fucking stupid that was, And like, so Paramore has been, as a band, somehow able to reflect back, even at the age of 14 and 15 years old, reflecting back to other people in other parts of the country and world, like, well, it's okay to be weird. We're weird right along with you. But then secondly, to really, again, hop in this time machine inside of that same Black People Love Paramore interview with Hayley Williams, she sort of asked, like, basically, when did this occur to you that this was happening? And again, just like watching the interview and seeing Taylor react in a way that became endearing from an artistic perspective, similarly jumped out of my skin because Hayley immediately said, I know when. Like, they're observant. If there's been one thing, if we can really blow this out into the stratosphere, man, if there's one thing I've learned from you, Kyle, and a lot of other people who have occupied this space in my life, it is about learning how to live feelings first in a way that also allows for the constant, like, monitoring of that feelings first vulnerability and being willing to not only recognize dangerous people who aren't safe for you to express that with, but secondly, being able to say, oh, no, I noticed that I was connecting with people in unconventional ways, and I chose to invest in that more because that's what matters. Like, it's not accidentally.
And it made my life so much better.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
it's so self-fulfilling because then you want to do it more and more, and then when you realize, like, well, I've done it with 3 people, what can I do it with 100, like, how much more can I do this and like create space for people to feel safe in themselves, and like, how much can I learn about myself in the process?
Yeah. And so what didn't happen is Paramore recognized this phenomenon, and then Hayley Williams starts dressing like fucking Billie Eilish. Like, instead it wasn't.
Oh, you mean White Cameron?
Everyone just got exactly the mental image I wanted them to get, and that's fantastic.
It's true. Like, I love Billie Eilish so much, but it is truly stupefying. I know why she did it, but it's just taken on a flavor.
Yeah.
Like, Like,
But
why do you dress like an NBA 2K creative player?
But that weirdness is a nice foil for like the genuineness that I hope people are catching from this moment. Of like, when you find yourself having connected with other people, and especially if you're ever lucky enough for an underprivileged person of any type to tell you to your fucking face, hey, what you did mattered to me and it matters to other people, man, you better wake the fuck up and pay attention. Nothing more important is going to happen in your whole life. And when you notice that other people are having that moment, you better listen to what they're saying. You better pay attention to their journey and how they observe themselves and how they've worked on themselves, because you've got shit to learn that is far beyond just like the music theory of a pop album.
And maybe this is just a function of, where we grew up in Atlanta in the mythological Black Mecca. But like, when Black Americans who have given the world everything cool from the 19th century on, when they say they see themselves in you, or you create space for them to be more of their best selves, that's a compliment that I don't know a single white person is deserving of because of 400 years of history. But I loved, my favorite part of that interview, to your point about Haley not shying away, was it would have been so easy to aw shucks out of that moment.
Exactly.
And to be like, I don't see color, but this is like, I'm very flattered by this, whatever. Recognizing the specific importance of validating that moment and knowing like how hard it is to come by and how much it means is like her signaling, I take this responsibility very seriously and it means a lot to me. Was like, you know what? Hell yeah. And I say that as somebody who like has somebody very dear to me who is a Black person who loves Paramore. My wonderful sister-in-law, Amber, Paramore is one of her favorite bands. And I remember being so struck, like when I first found that out, really? That's cool. Black girl at a Catholic high school on the south side of Atlanta, growing up, loving Paramore and pop punk and stuff. And just like, oh, it shifted my perspective. And like, I was really excited to tell her like, hey, first episode of the year is going to be about Paramore. I'm very excited about it. So thank you for opening my eyes to this band.
That's a nice segue too, because one more overly earnest note from Cliff, as usual, I guess. In that same moment that Haley Williams was responding to this, like, yeah, I did realize when our crowd became noticeably more diverse. What she did, though, in that moment was tied it back to her experience. This is why we give a shit about music, dude. This lit me up like crazy. She was saying, in that moment where I saw that diversity, what it reminded me of was the Stop Making Sense concert film of Talking Heads, where they panned the crowd and she said, the crowd is diverse. And I realized in that moment, as Haley Williams, like, I'm doing the thing. Like I did the thing that I saw here that I wished that I could be a part of. Mm-hmm. And now I found a way to do it here. Like when we talk about like music being this window into ways of looking at things, seeing things, understanding, contextualizing, to me, this is that line that we just expressed is like one of the clearest examples we've maybe ever had out of a modern artist, where it's like, no, listen, we are all constantly getting reinvigorated by the things that we've seen happen through music and the artistry of bringing diverse crowds together to enjoy something that's really unique and different. And then artists 20, 30, 40 years down the road are then repeating what they've seen before, driven by the energy they get from watching these old people do stuff. Like, and then once again, we have, like we've mentioned, people, kids like Willow making songs that are specifically based on their enjoyment of Paramore and other bands like that, and how they want to take it in a new direction for a new generation. Like, music is a way to tell time, and Paramore is a really cool band to exercise that with.
Looking at your fan base is such an interesting metric. If you're an artist and you're sitting at home and you're thinking like, how do I assess whether I've been successful in what I've endeavored to do? Like, the crowd thing quite often is the thing that you have the least control over.
Yeah.
Right. And that, going back to Nirvana, that plagued Kurt, where the people who bullied him in high school were the people that started showing up in his pits. And bringing it back to Turnstile, I didn't think about until just now when you were talking. You and I remarked on coming out of 2020 and starting to go back to shows that it was like the 21 Jump Street parking lot phenomenon. All of a sudden, punk shows were younger and they were more diverse, and just like 20 years of progress had happened overnight since we stopped going to shows. And I remember when we were standing by the soundboard at that first Turnstile headliner at the new Masquerade, not the one that I first saw Paramore at. And there's all these kids that are all so different looking and so beautiful, embracing each other, singing I Want to Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston before this fucking punk band comes on, and just being like, oh, shit's different now. It's not going to be the same, and it's better. And I think that segues right into artist intent, because the clearest signal of intent was them at When We Were Young Fest and the speech that she gave. And I contrast that with our very recent Furnace Fest experience, 2024, where it was the nostalgia equivalent of your dad sitting you down and making you smoke the carton of cigarettes. Like, I don't want to hear any open note, drop D breakdown bullshit ever again for the rest of my life. That's it. I'm done. I'm tapped out. I don't want to hear a single one of these fucking records made in 2004 ever again. No more. I'm done. Thanks. No more anniversary shows. That's it for me. I don't ever want to do it. I don't want to talk to the people that want to still live in this world. I'm ready to move the fuck on and be a guy in my 40s. This is all a big red MAGA hat soft version. I don't. So it was a clear, I was never the same person again after October of last year, because it was like two types of people in this world. There's either people that are focused on where we've been, coach would have put me in, we would have won state, or people focused on where we're going. Paramore could have very easily been the former, and they have expressly and exclusively been the latter. And, in referring back to the where we're going, I think she had the same sensation as us, saying ahead of When We Were Young Fest, they put out like kind of a statement. And she said, we've shifted the scene together, messily, angrily, heartbroken and determined. Tonight, ahead of their performance. Tonight, for me at least, is about celebrating all the facets of what punk music actually represents, all the things it wasn't allowed to be when we were young. And I felt the Furnace Fest, middle of the afternoon Furnace Fest sensation in my body watching that. Just like, what motivates these people to still be alive, living in the past like that? It's one thing to call on these moments that allow you to live in the present more fully, but being like, I love this thing that happened a long time ago and is a snapshot of who I no longer am, is just a denial of reality. And I'm going to get like real Lewis Blackie if I stay on this train too long, but it really pisses me off. And I hope you can send this episode to one friend in your life who is like that, and we can be the indirect way for you to be able to express, fuck you, get with the program and live in the present and start facing forward instead of facing backward.
One thing we'll definitely do before this episode closes out, I want to literally give people an exercise that are included in the group you just pointed out. The folks who are stuck trying to remember a nostalgic idea of what music was, and living with a rose-tinted version of what all of those scenes were, for sure. To me,
if you thought they were good, if you're looking at that era through rose-colored glasses, you were the problem.
Yeah. So I think what we can do, especially as my way of, and we'll talk about this in a second, like what to kind of focus on and isolate when you're paying attention to this record. To me, we've talked about a few of these in the past year for me, but this was another exploration and active research record, because something that I think we can talk through is, if you're going to be nostalgic, one of the things that we have at our disposal now that we've never in human history had before, that you should be taking advantage of, is like, okay, you want to listen to music from 2005? Great. Here's all of it. Bro, you can get to all of it now. Like, go back and find the other stuff. And I'll give a ton of jumping points that I think will really connect.
What were
with
people
both,
you
but-
never would have talked to in high school? What was their parallel reality? in
Exactly.
2005? Yeah.
Yeah, far
Yeah.
more interesting way of engaging, I think, with the things that you loved when you were a teenager. There are some Green Day songs that I like, and it's nice to listen to them on
Do
occasion.
you have the time?
But mostly what's interesting these days is to say, all right, then what was Green Day listening to back then that was better than them, but that was driving them to become the band that they would be? Like all of that stuff is now available to us. And I think as much as any artist that we've covered recently, Paramore is one that will take you along for the ride there. So I think we'll come back to that part, especially because I've got some cool jumping off points, but I think we should also specifically speak to, there was a tonal shift on this record, and it apes some pretty specific bands and time frames. And I think it's important to really draw that out. And you know, the easiest one to intro, which we had already mentioned, was Talking Heads. Like clearly Stop Making Sense was on repeat here. And, you know, everyone's first mention of genre shifts on this record are Block Party anyway, both of which, Talking Heads and Block Party, both of which I didn't and kind of don't give a shit about at all.
Oh man, that one Block Party record is so good though. What is Silent Alarm?
Just a moment I missed entirely, but clearly that is what's drawing out a lot of the kind of changes in songwriting approach, but I think also has a sort of reflexive effect on how the production ended up, because I think Talking Heads especially is a good example to me of, like, even during the reverb craze of the era that they existed in, they had a tight rhythmic concept to them that I kind of feel a modern version of here, all the way on the other end of the loudness wars back to when albums can sound fairly reasonable when produced well. Is there any other like aspects of that you think are important to draw out? Because that's definitely my biggest blank spot.
The post-punk, the art rock thing, and I know we'll go all the way down the rabbit holes of other dimensions through which to explore that. But I would draw attention to a lot of stuff that sounds like this musically. The musical backdrop is met with atonal vocals, like David Byrne, Tom Tom Club. Block Party is kind of sneery, kind of talky. Karen O from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, The Strokes. It's not like good. I mean, just like, with all due respect, it's not good singing. It's not meant to be.
Yeah.
But like, Haley's a fucking bomb singer from Meridian, Mississippi. grew up in the church. She can sang sang. So a really good, deft, finessey sense of melody on top of kind of post-punky stuff is different. Like, I cannot think of literally one other single example of somebody that tuneful in a band that sounds like this. That's cool.
Yeah, I think that's an important note to draw out, and potentially something worth focusing on in a counterintuitive way. Yeah, this is a pretty vocally led band for good reasons. But on this record in particular, like, a lot of the criticisms about this record from people who do otherwise like Paramore were, why is she doing this Brandon Flowers ass thing then? Because, like, she's pretty good at singing, and the reason a lot of the other ones do that is because they can't. But I think knowing where that style comes from is probably helpful.
I'm sorry. I didn't think about the Killers, and now I'm just thinking about My Social Life, a chiropractic appointment. Just now I'm falling asleep, and now she's calling a cab to go to the chiropractor. Like, just trying to meld those two things together in my mind. It's very, very good. Brandon Flowers, another, like, I don't know, maybe he's a perfectly nice guy, but I just, like, so much of this, the nostalgia tripper thing brought up for me the Promising Young Woman phenomenon, like the guys in that movie who act like they're so good, but they're like neoliberal shitty. And it just reminded me of all the horrible MySpace dudes that were the Democrat half of that bomber plane meme, like, in this house we believe, or whatever. And then they're still rapists. I'm glad most of those guys aren't really doing anything now, like selling real estate or whatever.
No, they're just the front men of Falling in Reverse.
Hey, you better watch out. He'll search the transcript.
Yeah, I fucking know. Yeah, I know. So then, okay. So I want to use maybe some of the songs as jumping off points to go in a couple of different directions. And I think actually Killers would be a kind of good reference for this moment. So C'est Comme Ça, the song on this album, probably the most... just literally because of the hi-hat work is extraordinarily reminiscent of a very particular sound, you know, in the mid-aughts from these types of bands.
C'est comme ça, c'est comme ça, na-na-na-na-na-na. C'est comme ça, c'est comme ça, na-na-na-na-na-na. C'est comme ça, c'est comme ça, na-na-na-na-na-na. C'est comme ça, c'est comme ça, na-na-na-na-na-na.
When I started sitting with it and saying, okay, actually, what are the weird things that were happening at the same moment in time in music that are interesting offshoots that take me in more fun directions than just I will go listen to an old record now. And so just a few of them that all of a sudden started coming back to me at a time where, you know, we were, and maybe we'll never have a moment like this again, but like when you heard a new album you liked, you then had to do your like DSL speed internet researching to then go figure out how to spend your other download time trying to get other bands onto your iPod. And so there was the same sort of approach of discovery that we have today, but none of the tools, none of the speed, and a lot more commitment to individuals. But it felt exciting because at that moment, it felt like everything was exploding. We had never been able to put all that music onto a single device before. So that felt like, you know, the infinity opening up in front of us. And so going back and thinking about C'est Comme Ça specifically, what in that song then reminded me of other songs, artists, and records that were starting to become weird offshoots in that same time frame. So one that came to mind that's just like a weird little offshoot. There were these little bands that would pop up trying to capture this sound, and like happened a lot more back in the MySpace and Pure Volume era, you would get a sort of one-hit wonder, but in the sense that the hit was big only inside of a niche, inside of a niche, inside of a niche in Pure Volume.
Yep.
But they would become famous inside of that little bubble, right? One band that popped out really quickly and then went back was called Joan Zetta, and they had this song called Communicate, and it was... I remember sort of picking this song out at the moment because it was trying to draw out both the dance rock rhythms that we hear on C'est Comme Ça and a lot of these other songs, but then had a straight up breakdown later in the song. And it was just like an extraordinarily like 2006 thing. And so that song's not necessarily great, but might click in for some people who were there during that particular moment. But then other areas that I think will be even more recognizable depending on what color track jacket you might have been wearing during that time. So one of them is just trying to bring back in dance and almost disco related vibes and rhythm and all that stuff. A couple of hops away from that, we were just beginning to, you know, I mentioned earlier, emo was not, I'm not going to go on record saying it became cool at any point necessarily, but also just calling out like it was just sort of like a weird subgenre of music at the time. And one of the things that evolved it specifically was this album that came out from the Legion of Doom called Incorporated. And every song on there was a mashup of two, basically what we'd now probably call emo, at the time would have been post-hardcore or post-punk or whatever. But I mean, you know, they were mashing up bands like Census Fail and all this, but they also had, I mean, some pretty killer. I
forgot all about this record. Oh my God.
Yeah, like there was Me Without You and some of the old weird Under Oath stuff they made really cool. And like that whole album was in and of itself a kind of moment in time that's worth revisiting, either if you haven't ever, or if you were sort of alive during that and you haven't listened to that particular record in a while. Like that was like a monumental kind of cultural shift, because not only was someone mashing stuff up, but like they were introducing hip hop elements into music that was just like diametrically opposed to hip hop to begin with.
Every Time I Die.
Yeah. Oh,
The Hot Damn Every Time I Die with Memphis by Norma Jean.
Yes.
With a KRS-One verse
Yes.
is still like, what combination of drugs and bad expired beers did you have to put in your body to think like, yep, there's the triangle. We did it.
Just a few cans of Sparks and a cracked version of Reason.
Oh yeah, this is pre-Four Loko.
That's right. That's right. Back when we didn't know that you could drink too much caffeine and alcohol at one time.
Well, Spark was the one that tasted like an old sweet tart that you got out from the bottom of a sink.
Yeah, so naturally I liked it a lot. But even just thinking about that Legion of Doom record specifically, like that came sort of just before Girl Talk and that whole mashup explosion that sort of happened for a minute. That was really interesting to everybody, I guess. And then they went right back into obscurity. But like another sort of adjacent band to this was Death from Above 1979, You're a Woman, I'm a Machine, was
Love
like
that band.
pretty groundbreaking back then as well. And again, was just sort of like bringing in other weird aspects of music and piling them up together in, more or less a less nuanced way than Minus the Bear was, and sort of, trying to be more catchy. And, Death from Above would go on to become something slightly different.
I just saw them at Webster Hall do that record.
Oh yeah.
Very cool.
And the last one that popped up for me, which again, speaking of, cycling back now, around the same time was when Blood Brothers, they dropped Young Machetes, which like Blood Brothers doesn't necessarily belong in a conversation that involves Paramore or anything else that's fairly melodic, but they were on the very odd end of the post-hardcore thing that was also happening during this time. And if you want to know what I'm picturing when I think of that little corner, like Horse the Band is a good example of the kind of weird, just abstractly weird shit that was attempting to happen.
Boo.
Yeah. Okay,
We're back in the toxic masculinity hole we've been trying to avoid.
It wasn't 2 episodes ago that you came down on me for booing and gave me a lecture I deserve, so I'm going to play that back for you later on.
You're right, but also I don't think mine was the guy with the Nintendo glove that was the Hallmark Channel Harmar superstar.
Integrating a power glove into your show is a positive thing, but
yeah, speaking of you can't pick your fans, my god, that band.
But that just sort of reminded me, like, so Blood Brothers was occupying this very weird abstract post-hardcore space, but they flirted with dance elements at different times, and especially on Young Machetes, that again is a cool offshoot using Paramore as a time machine and kind of going back to not only a time from when Paramore was releasing, their first album, but again, C'est Comme Ça and other songs on this album remind you of a thing that was evolving from a particular time. And something I've really come to love is just like going back to the years right before a genre started exploding and solidifying and seeing what was happening back then. It's always an interesting journey for me. And so to me, it's a really cool way to engage with this record in particular.
I hadn't thought about a single one of those bands. And I love everything that you just brought up.
Yep.
And it brings to mind this rise of the mythological indie sleaze thing that everybody's Mandela affecting lately. And C'est Comme Ça to me sounded like Take Me Out by Franz Ferdinand.
For sure.
Which I think would go on a list with all the stuff you mentioned, and then like LCD Sound System and Check. I thought a little bit as you were talking about one of Carolee, my wife Carolee's favorite records, Dance Macabre by The Faint. But it's like, if you take all of that and you put it in a time capsule and then you dig it up and you listen to it next to Paramore, it's like those two things evolved on split timelines. And this arrives in a sort of higher vibrational plane than all of that stuff.
Yep.
But they do share a little bit of a core spirit and like intersect in a weird perpendicular way. So like all that stuff is really cool, but they're just like coming at it from a fundamentally different, arguably funkier angle. Because like not very many of the bands that you mentioned, I would say, going back to After Laughter and thinking about how there's like clear Nile Rodgers chic type influence, and they were like trying to be polished funk as a new thing, a different thing, or like Talking Heads, the funk influence that they were trying to ape. Like not a lot of that's really in the like New York art rock indie sleaze stuff because it was all a lot rougher. But you have to think about the going back to the Tennessee hardcore band playing in a church rec room punk aesthetic, and they polished all that roughness into a tight little isotope in the middle of the bomb.
Yep. 3 more very quick and easy examples, maybe before we go into kind of impact and close out conversation here. Like, again, just giving examples of how to engage with this record actively in the sort of like manic research thing that I like to do sometimes, which can complement active listening, but to me is more of just like it's a different way of engaging with the music that causes you to listen to it differently. So like 3 things that I immediately popped out. The song Running Out of Time. You've already mentioned Taylor's guitar work and just how it's interesting to focus on and very economical. His verse work here on Running Out of Time immediately reminds me of Circa Survive, which is another band that is, I think, spiritually analogous maybe to Paramore in the sense that they do 2 things. One is they were sort of formed and evolved in a very similar scene, time frame, and all that. And so a lot of the Glassjaw-esque worship of things is coming out naturally, but in some slightly different ways. Circa Survive is a band that has a lot of that post-hardcore guitar work, but is also a band that is extraordinarily vocals focused because they're blessed with a very unique and talented vocalist. So again, you just listening to Running Out of Time and just sort of taking it out like, oh, the sound of that reminds me of one of those early Circa Survive records. 2 other quick ones, Liar, but also then Crave, would also both remind me of Cocteau Twins, which I'm not so sure would have immediately popped out to me the same way had we not spent so much time focused on Heaven or Las Vegas in recent months. But we spent a ton of time in that episode just talking about like, oh shit, doesn't everyone sound like this to you now that you've heard it and thought about it? And like, once again, here it is. I even heard in Red people, even attempting to be like, this Paramore record sometimes sounds like My Bloody Valentine with a vocalist. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but I can see the line of thought, and being able to go back once again to Dream Pop is a cool offshoot for sure.
There's so much of the story of Cocteau Twins, the dynamic between the members of that band, the story of the song Liar, the energy of the song, and kind of like melodically is probably the closest thing to that dream pop world. And I remember in the interview, Haley talking about how excited she was to get that instrumental and be like, this is different. I can do something different with this. Yeah, I never would have made that connection, but I totally agree. It's a really special song. It's really, really tender and beautiful.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat and actually give you 2 more quick ones. Crave, specifically, you mentioned Turnstile earlier. The intro guitar tone on Crave, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but I mean, it sounds exactly like Glow On era Turnstile guitar. And again, just it's fun to hear a thing and go, what is in my brain that I'm thinking of, that I'm sort of like abstractly picturing that sounds like it. That's a really fun way to engage with music, I think. And
Crave and Underwater Boy are like spiritual cousins. I agree with that assessment too.
Yeah. And then I'll just mention as well, like Thick Skull, I think we both ended up really, really liking this track. The fact that it was the final track not only reminded me, like I said, of My Heart off of Paramore's first record because it was the last song, but strangely enough, it reminded me of Carry On from Fiona Apple's record. Carry On was the last song there and had this weird like, oh, we're not phoning it in for the last song.
Yeah.
We're going to do something intense and moving and different. And so again, just as an exercise, that I mean, how many other ways can you go from Death from Above 1979 to Fiona Apple in the space of a few songs? Like, that's what this sort of exercise does for me when I encounter albums like this. I don't have to love it as my favorite piece of music for it to inspire me to not only appreciate the songs, but also just like use it as research material and go back and try to understand what they're piping in.
Yeah, love music more because they clearly do.
Yeah.
I think you hit like a lot of the things that I would want to say about the same exercise of what to focus on or isolate. I just want to hit them with a finer point real quick. You talked about the verse work and running out of time. In the Zane Lowe interview, Taylor talked about verses and bridges. So like obviously with a pop band, the main place you're going to go mentally is choruses, but I would encourage you to instead look everywhere around there. Every bridge on this record is interesting, and they do cool like basic stuff in the verses too. And Taylor talked about liking writing those parts better because that's where his latitude as a guitarist and producer is. Also subverted my expectations of what Haley would be doing on this record the more I thought about it, because she is such a bomb vocalist and she's so present live. Like you can't help but like sort of fix your gaze on her because of the hair and the big personality and all the stuff and the voice, obviously. But she feels less in the front of the mix than previous albums.
For sure.
Like there's a lot of ethereal vocals, and there's places where the recording sounds really raw. Like in the chorus of The News, they sure could have like sloughed off the edges of that waveform a little more, but they kind of left it raw on purpose. And because it's not trying to like over deliver Haley Williams to you, to me, that makes it more compelling to tune in with what she is doing. It's artful, but it's not too like David Byrne, like, oh, you know. I think the lyrical approach, like, sure, it's not my favorite record lyrically ever, but there's a clear headspace of I'm going to be funny when I'm talking about bad stuff or like a little bit satirical or whatever. And then I'll be vulnerable actually when it might be good. Whereas previously, I think there was a little bit of the inverse maybe. And so there are moments of like the former, the funny when it's bad. In Running Out of Time, there are these little tiny ad libs where she says like, there was a fire, and then she goes, and then be there in 5. And it's like, that's so clutch and maybe hip hop informed, but also just funny and weird the way that's delivered. And then really earnest, like in Crave, the any second, feel the present, future and past connecting. As I get older, I've experienced that phenomenon, and that is just, it's collapsed in a really nice sort of fortune cookie way to talk about that feeling. But yeah, Thick Skull is the one on this record that if you don't listen to anything else, you just need to go let it sledgehammer you directly in your soul. It's interesting that it was written on the first day of the sessions, and it's very different than anything else Paramore has ever done. And somebody wrote really beautifully about it. You know, they said it's about the metaphoric connection between the search for safety and understanding and the inherent vulnerability that comes with publicly embarking on that journey through music. So everything we talked about, feelings first in a big way. And they described it as they were unearthing the sounds, they were like, man, this sounds like a band I would love, which is just like creatively, that's a cool thing. They talked about how it had shades of a few different eras of them being music fans, to your point of researched, loving heavy, drony, almost shoegazy moments, which are like not words that I would use to describe the end point of the song at all. But I also get it. But the thing that really strikes me about this song that like, I'm not afraid to admit has made me like heaving cry, and the video especially. It's really the only place that Haley goes full tilt vocally on the whole record, like full throat at the end of the song. And not even for the heaviest lyrics either. Like the heaviest lyrics on this record are the fucking opening of the song. I'd rather insert a clip than read them and get a frog in my throat. But it's like every single time I hear them and thinking about what she's talking about in the song, just like, what if all the things people have said about me over the years are true? And I was so sure of who I was before the world broke, and it broke all of us.
I am a magnet for broken pieces. I am attracted to broken people. I pick 'em up and now my fingers are bleeding, and it looks like my fault. And it looks like I'm caught red-handed.
That's a hard examination to do. And I think our social fabric is tearing because so many people are so unwilling to do that examination. And so, like, if you don't fuck with the music, if you don't fuck with Hayley Williams, like something demagnetizes you away from anything that we've said, just do the exercise of just sitting with the feeling of that song musically and what she's talking about, and just let it fill you with oceanic feeling for a minute. And you might hate it. And you might not have a therapist that helps you be equipped to deal with all the shit that floods into your consciousness when you really let it all in. But the world's never going to get any better if we don't all individually do more of that type of work. So I'm grateful that that song exists on a lot of levels, but especially that one. And it's really, really, really brought home by the video. And I think that speaks to the genius of Brendan Yates, that they went back to the same location for a second time. They didn't shoot them at the same time. They went back to the same place that they shot the This Is Why video and brought it full circle. And we mentioned how the record starts and ends quietly. And there's something so circular and inward and meditative that Brendan draws out really beautifully, like an introverted Pisces artist. And I never would have thought, if you love Turnstile, go check out Paramore. But I do see so many strains of what Brendan's artistic intent is for that band as what Hayley's and the guys is for Paramore, especially now. I see the real convergence. So if you've been waiting on a long time for the follow-up to Glow On, maybe This Is Why can be there for you in ways you didn't expect.
Even though I am on record frequently as someone who could, for the most part, care less about lyrics, not only did the ones that you sort of alluded to in Thick Skull hit me, but also I think I've talked around this a bit, but just kind of saying it directly in this record, in another interview about this record, Paramore as a band, basically described themselves, all three, as being at different stages of unraveling their relationship to faith. And, we mentioned the sort of church scene, punk band comeuppance, and all of that. And yeah, we, and especially me, I guess, have, a uniquely intertwined experience with that kind of exact trajectory. But in that sense, the lyrics of Thick Skull, and then especially, or in addition to that, a song that's about something different, but in Big Man, Little Dignity, she says, I keep thinking this time the end will be different, but it isn't. And I think the sensation, the sort of emotional sensation of vulnerability, like you're talking about, sitting with a song like Thick Skull, I think will let you try to absorb as much as possible of what this band is saying that they're kind of going through in this moment as people, and that frankly I identified with quite a bit. Just man, I've been around for a while. I've been looking at stuff, observing things, making statements, hoping for the best, saying what should be different, speaking truth to power where I could, saying things are wrong where they need to be, trying my best to cause good trouble, like John Lewis told me to, trying to do all of those things. And yet 20 years after becoming an adult, I am still also in a various stage of effectively deconstructing and unraveling a relationship to faith, which in and of itself requires this open-ended vulnerability that to me ties with what you're saying about the lyrics in Thick Skull, where it's just in order to figure out whether you're the person you think you are or that you want to be, you have to actually engage with the question of, are all the things people say about me true? You have to be willing to go through that to know what's true about yourself. And so even though I can't say that the lyrics alone as a standalone piece of word smithing impacts me at such a deep level, but when I combine what's being talked about on this record, the context of the individual people, how vulnerable they are with where they are in their lives, and then watching these people who are just otherwise committed to making music as a collective and really no necessary ties to a particular way of being, watching them attempt to be brave and still come out the other end and yeah, it's cool that they won a Grammy or two about this record, but it's also just cool that they exist still, and that they choose to exist in this method individually and as a group. I mean, their whole existence as a unit expresses a sense of reconciliation, forgiveness, and growth between people. Like these are people who have grown apart and then grew back together intentionally. And like when I put all of those pieces together, that is when I come back to, okay, now a single line in a song can kind of knock me over because I know where I'm standing now, and I can kind of feel the weight of what's happening, and I can feel what I have to do with this. Like something is being said about me too here that I could probably engage with if I'm not afraid. And when songs have a U-shaped hole that you can step into, it's a pretty special moment. And I definitely felt that way about this record, but it took me a while to get there. Like I had to actually go in and figure out what this meant and what it had to do with me. And then come to find out it's got a lot to do with me, even though it's got nothing to do with me, you know?
And think about, extrapolate that to people that don't have all the advantages that you and I have. And it goes back to the making life better, more tolerable for people who really need it the most. I'm grateful for this band, which again is not a thing I thought I would ever say about Paramore, about like a band that started in the same amoeba as Taylor Swift. Just in today's culture of artists being able to talk about mental health as openly and directly as they do so regularly, it's easy to take for granted the work that they have done just by being themselves and by being feelings first and out there. But I hope that in the long run, that's what they're remembered for as much as the songs, is the growth and the being vulnerable, because so many other bands that have had the tumult that they've had started shitty and stayed shitty. And there being elements of forgiveness and growth and changing alone and changing together into better versions of themselves is really admirable. And there are a lot of cues that we can take from that. And I suspect that we'll only be able to continue to learn more as time goes on and they continue to heal themselves through the power of music.
You know what? And while we're being corny on this playing together, I just want to push a little further into it too. I think thinking about
if you don't like it, fuck you. Go listen to the Bach episode. Go listen to or Meshuggah. Go listen to something else if you got to be cool and tough and whatever.
Well, yeah, cool and tough is not welcome here any longer. What we're like,
I will beat you up. I want you to hear my voice clearly when I say, if you think you're cool and tough, I will beat your ass. I will fly to your city to do it. Get vulnerable or I will kill you.
Yes, between the two of us, provoking Kyle would be the ultimate accident for sure. But to lean in then on the power of music, even something that came back up for me in listening to Paramore talk about themselves and in listening to them sort of explain what's kept them alive and helped them evolve, it connected me back to, and hopefully this will jog enough people's memory maybe to connect to the capital D discourse about it. But people talk about the missing third places a lot in our lives now, and that we had these external places outside of our homes to go to and be in community with other people, and that they effectively don't exist anymore thanks to capitalism, which is 100% true. And then COVID really shut that door and sealed it shut to the point to where any quote unquote third places have had a really hard time existing and persisting through any of that. I love that we started an urbanism rabbit hole in the Paramore episode. Shout out to our dude King Williams and all the many great urbanists in Atlanta who have taught us things about the importance of place and deriving meaning from place. That's a great non-music rabbit hole that you can pursue in terms of finding meaning and feelings first, and community all derives from having physical places to do it. It cannot solely exist, as we've seen from the erosion of the social fabric, in digital spaces. Digital spaces can help, but they are not the answer. Got to have physical places. You got to have places to go and hug necks and be around people. And like we said in the Jeff Buckley episode, touch grass. Yep. And so what I'm about to say goes along with all of that. It doesn't contradict any of it. Yeah, I agree. We're missing those third spaces and places. Okay, well, I'll tell every human being alive, listen to me, shows are still happening. Go to the shows. Go to the shows. It is maybe one of the one lingering third places that still exist where you can go do something that you actually want to connect with. When you go there, you will be around people who have chosen to take their fucking Tuesday night and 28 and come see this weird ass band from the Midwest.
Yeah, and
with
their money that doesn't go nearly as far as it
exactly.
used to.
Yeah. But like, where else can you most naturally congregate with people who would care about the same things as you so much as shows still provide the opportunity to do nowadays? I don't go to shows and just start striking up conversations with strangers. I'm not saying you got to go and meet 5 new people and introduce yourself and exchange numbers. You're not networking, but like, dude, being around, literally physically around people who give a small shit about the same thing you do. If your only version of touching grass is going to a local-ish, indie-ish show once a month, or if you want to be like us, push it into once a week. Like Cliff, am saying it will sustain you in a way that you didn't expect. But it also, the reason it's being brought up for me in this episode is because that's how Haley and everyone else in this band just talked about their relationship to music. That the way that their music was written here is that they just kept writing music together. They just kept doing it. Every time they would talk about what really meant something to them over the years and why they didn't effectively sell out at a number of really particular opportunities to do so, they would just say things like, all we wanted to do was play another show and be with people.
Yeah, they kept talking about being in community.
Yeah.
Like realizing the value of their community in Nashville when they were on a hiatus and like lost in the wilderness a little bit, and realizing that their community was to be found in music.
Yeah, and it feels silly to look back at a shape of a scene that included something like Maylene and the Sons of Disaster and call that my community. And yet now, me, today, this
My
looking
culture
back
is
on
not
it-
your costume. It was a great community.
But-
It really was.
But looking back on it now, I can see the things that I didn't want to overly focus on back then. Things like, and I've ended up expressing these in recent years too, speaking of third places that are actually still safe for people. One of the reasons it was always weird to me to reject somebody based on the way that they looked, talked, or thought was because every show I went to had extraordinarily weird fucking people who were welcome there.
Mm-hmm.
Every show we've ever gone to where someone was attending in a wheelchair, those people were ushered to the front of the concert without question or even dialogue between all of the people who were there. It was an understood moment, right? There was no such thing as like seeing someone walk in the door and making fun of them for how they dressed or who they liked or what, like, it truly was like, well, if you're here for this, then you're here for this.
Yep.
And we're all here together. And like reflecting on those moments always energized me still to this day. And it's part of the reason I still go to shows as a habit and a discipline and not just as an opportunistic thing. But couching it in the context of like how this particular band has grown by caring about the community of people that they have assembled through their music, man, it went straight to my emotion nerve, whatever that is, and really opened me up and made me grateful again. And
Yeah, the second you start feeling like it's not possible to exist anywhere in the world, like that sensation of people caring about each other and not being dicks and whatever, like a show is the reset button, the Nintendo reset button for that,
Yeah.
where you can be like, okay, well, at least there's one place, you know?
yes. Now, thanks for, well, actually, no one had the opportunity to indulge that. You're listening to a podcast and we talked about it. So cool. But on a much baser level, like going all the way back up to something that's a bit more surface, let's also close out part of this discussion by just doing the whole kaleidoscope of all the different places you can go if anything interests you out of this record, because not only do we have a ton of places to start like we always do, but I mean, they had a straight up remix version of this album that serves as a pretty good list of
speaking of
artists. to be
community,
sure of.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So where should we begin? Is the remix record the right place to start?
Probably. I always go psycho with this section, so I would love for you to get the first word.
Okay.
We're talking about playlist possibilities. Kyle's about to go sicko mode.
Well, okay. What we'll do for sicko mode is I will maybe outline some of the categories you're about to drop the fuck into. But so yeah, we mentioned the remix album. So RE : This Is Why, regarding This Is Why, for those of you who weren't around when we made phrases like RE : all the songs are not only slightly different from their original, but are done with a very interesting, diverse group of people who are, just straight line influenced by this band. And
would never appear in sequence in any other context, like not even a Bonnaroo lineup.
No. And calling out, I at least see two kind of subcategories, whether it's Foles or Panda Bear are some of the artists on the remix record, and like Panda Bear, I just otherwise know as a dude who is in Animal Collective.
Right.
But like, there's this sort of category, I think, of sort of contemporaries, but also people who were barking up weird trees around the same time or just before.
For sure.
As Paramore was evolving. But then all the way on the other hand, the Linda Lindas are on here, man. Unimpeachably cool modern bands for younger people, like the Linda Lindas. And
they're young, like Paramore was young.
Yeah.
Very cool, yeah.
And doing something really specific with a lot of success, which is awesome. But then also other versions of modern evolutions of what Paramore has done, like Wet Leg, I think would be an example of that as well. Any other standouts on that to you?
Julian Baker, young people from the South with the religious trauma, and she did Thick Skull, which I think was the perfect one for her to take on. I love that Dami and JD Beck, the like weird freak jazz duo, are on this. That they have a sort of spirit of let's get in a room and work out our demons or whatever. I think Remy Wolf is just very cool. Like, I don't really have any remarks other than like
she has some really cool stuff at Bonnaroo 2025. They got announced very recently.
Oh, sick.
Yeah,
sick. Very weird lineup this year. I forgot she was on it. There was a Pitchfork article that literally the headline was Paramore's influence is all around us. And the remix album, I think they did a really good job of capturing what the extent of that influence feels like. Even if it's not in totality, it's a good cross section.
Yeah. And I tried as best I could, especially to touch on what's expressed in that article specifically, with the one extra clear vein of like Paramore directly inspiring Willow, Olivia Rodrigo, Billie Eilish, and other similar folks who are doing things like that now. So I think that some of the other categories that we could sort of go ham on, you have this categorized as angular. That is a fun way of describing what I would probably use other words for, but this constellation of sharp, weird rock that is very rhythmically consequential, I guess, for lack of a better term.
I say angular to describe music that sounds to me, brings images in my mind of the Ralph Steadman drawings of Hunter S. Thompson, like a human body at freaky angles. It's like not fluid. It's a little bit cubist.
So inside of that, even looking at the list that I get to cheat sheet on of the things that you put down, I'm pretty blown away and could talk for 45 more minutes about all of this stuff. But like definitely give me some highlights in terms of like the Block Party and Foles and Yeah's direction that we've sort of mentioned of like the art rock and all that. And then other kind of offshoots, whether it's like post-punk or synth driven music, just like hit us.
Yeah, I think the art rock stuff is pretty well covered. So the like early aughts, New York, and you adding they're not New York, but they're Canada. I think about them in the context of New York now, but like Death from Above stuff too. So art rock and indie sleaze. The Yeahs being a big one, and like Karen O, a trio, whatever. There's a lot there, and they've evolved a lot record to record. Post-punk, I think if you want to go in harder directions, like Gang of Four comes up for me here mentally. And I know we're going to talk about Gang of Four later in the year, spoiler, but like you could go as heavy as like Wire, Pink Flag is a record I'm thinking of specifically, Devo, the first Devo record, or even Wipers, which is like way more sort of like negative, atonal, whatever vibe, but snotty in the same ways. Or you could go synthier, gothier. You talk about The Cure, which they've always said has been an influence. You could do Joy Division or Ecstasy or even Public Image Limited. So it's sort of like goth rock, but dancey, like not quite all the way into the Bauhausy type stuff is another way to think about this stuff musically. And then there's a shit ton of current like post-punk influence stuff that's so good. Haley herself shouted out Amyl and the Sniffers from Australia, who are way more like sneery and vulgar and whatever than I think Paramore or whatever try to be. But Haley approved. A band that is originally from Atlanta, but now resides in New York, Balkans. The first Balkans record is very in this vein. You mentioned Wet Leg. They are super cool. The Chaise Lounge song, very divisive. And I love that. And I think that evokes some of the Paramore spirit. People that don't like it really, really viscerally hate it. And that makes it cooler to me. But other bands like Yard Act, Omni, also from Atlanta, Preoccupations, Font, Div, The Homesick, Chad Van Galen, everybody seemed to love the Fontaines record that came out last year. I agree. Romance, very cool band. Evolved past the sort of post-punky stuff, but still of that ilk. And then Idols. There's a like I could see Idols opening for Paramore on a big tour, and that bill would work really well, I think. And then we've mentioned Turnstile and Brendan a number of times, but like a Paramore Turnstile bill would be right up the alley.
I would add Scowl to it.
Oh yeah. I'm very interested for what this new Scowl stuff is going to sound like. They've been very unpredictable release to release. Like we thought it was going to be straight up Santa Cruz hardcore with a cool lead singer with interesting hair colors, and they have shocked and awed kind of every time they've come out with a new wave of things, and they just have an indescribable cool X factor in addition to putting out cool songs. That's like one of my 4-year-old's favorite bands, as I've shown you through videos. She loves dancing along to the Psychic Dance Routine video, which makes me very proud as a dad.
Another offshoot category, I'll let you add some too, but you know, we've touched on this a little bit, but I just want to re-impress. If you are infected with When We Were Young disease and you keep needing to go back and listen to the records that you liked back then, try to just listen to other records that you didn't necessarily give the time of day at the same era, similar genres, whatever. I think moments like this where there's a path to your own nostalgia, if you liked a band early, gives you a better path to doing something more interesting with that than just listening to songs that you'd heard before. A couple that you mentioned here, Kyle, that really lit me up thinking about the downloading curiosity era. It right in those like mid-aughts, especially not necessarily stylistically the same as what Paramore was doing or is doing, but just interesting bands that were coming out around the same time. You mentioned And You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead, which was like, it really delighted me to reconnect to that particular moment in time. And another band you pointed out was Hum. Like both of those were bands right at exactly the same time where I was frantically downloading a lot of that music.
Trail of Dead freaked me out, man.
Yeah.
They were weird and cool. Yeah. They opened for Queens. Did you know that in the Songs for the Deaf era?
No, but that tracks.
Weird fucking bill, dude. Yeah. So this started, I called it 03 Mix CD in the outline, but it started because I saw multiple places where they talked about Failure, the band Failure being something they were all really into early on. And like, that's a cool, you got to be cool if you know, I went into the city and bought a CD type thing where like, I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast, but you used to have a blog in high school and you were like early to the blogging. You were early to making like zip file download accessible on, I think like your own server or an early like rapid share type thing. And there was so much stuff that I was like, fuck, he's so much cooler than me. He knows all the stuff I've never heard of, like Velvet Underground and Nico I had no exposure to, and like you were really into Sun House, and I could almost remember every single one of the albums you put on that thing because it was so like iconoclastic for me. And failure, like them being into Failure as 14, 15-year-olds evokes that same feeling of like coolest kid at the high school. Like they have a currency that I don't have. And on the Paramore artist page on Spotify, they literally have a playlist called Haley's Mix from Zach 2002. And it's got a lot of this stuff. So like kind of cheating to say, but Failure, Deftones, Jimmy Eat World, who I know you're a big fan of and have talked about multiple times. You mentioned Glassjaw, Sunny Day Real Estate from the emo world. You mentioned Hum and Trail of Dead, early Death Cab. Like I know a lot of the cool dudes that we're still friends with are really into transatlanticism. And then
This
Elliott
is the new year.
Yeah. Elliott Smith, God bless that sad boy.
Anywhere else you'd recommend off?
You know, if you're into the Haley Williams of it all, I would just quickly talk about, I don't want to reduce it to cool women, but one thing we've like consciously tried to get better at over the years is talking about and celebrating more women, because we didn't do it well enough when we first started. And we've realized over the years, like how much we were really missing by having such a like white dude and rock band centered view of the musical universe. And that has been like a great joy of finding more and more music. So some of Haley's favorite voices and vocal influences, Debbie Harry and Blondie, like you can't go wrong with Blondie. The Shangri-Las, Susie Sue from, of the Banshees fame, Gwen Stefani, and like set aside whatever she's doing now, hawking the prayer app from her boyfriend, no doubt was fucking cool and groundbreaking. Beyonce and Solange, Sade, Brody from the Distillers, totally inimitable voice. Probably, I'd be hard pressed to say my favorite on this list, but like strictly vocally, I would say Brody is maybe my favorite here. Björk, and then Erykah Badu, and like later period stuff, you see more of the Solange, Sade, Erykah Badu stuff, but I would strongly encourage down those rabbit holes. And then you can back into Paramore from some of the new, young, cool singers. You mentioned we talked about Billie Eilish. She sang Misery Business at Coachella, which is very cool. Chappell Roan, who, when she was starting to catch hell for setting boundaries as an artist and as a human being, like giving of herself publicly, there was stuff written about like artists who reached out to her to say, you're doing the right thing, and reinforce her. And one of those people was Haley Williams, and Chappell said, quote, Haley Williams is the strongest bitch ever. So like if you feel something for what Chappell has done as an artist and person has resonated with you, Haley's been doing that same thing for 20 years. So there's a kindred spirit thing there. I would love to hear Haley cover My Kink is Karma. That Chappell Roan record is unimpeachably good. Top to, like, it's like, you remember when Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park came out and everyone had it, no matter who they were.
Uh-huh.
And it just it shattered every boundary. Like the Chappell Roan record is like that to me, where it's just like, I don't know how you can be alive and say you like music and not find something from that record that just blows you away. So good. You also mentioned Olivia Rodrigo, but I would also mention Girl in Red and SZA. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Haley and SZA have both said, regardless of genre, Doechii is the best artist out right now. Alligator Bites Never Heal, The Denial is a River video. Like, you need to be up on Doechii. If you are listening, you need to check that record out, because that shit bangs.
Snorted probably would. What can I say? The shit works, it feels good, and my self-worth's at an all-time low. And just when it couldn't get worse, my ex crashed my place and destroyed all I owned. Whoopsie, made a oopsie. $100,000 oops made me loopy. I ain't a killer, but don't push me. Don't wanna have to turn a nigga guts into soup beans.
Whoa. Okay, Doechii. We don't want to revert back into our old ways, so we're gonna try a breathing.
Not a bad time to check out music from any of the three people that you just mentioned. And in fact, also, Haley Williams said that SZA was her number one wish for collaboration. And so now I have an unrealized wish that's going to stick out in my life. Because I like...
God, how good would that be?
I like inordinately like SZA records. So the idea that this could potentially happen
Going back to scene stuff, before I ever listened to a SZA song, I decided that I was going to like her because she played, I want to say Coachella. She played a really big outdoor festival in an Every Time I Die shirt. The famous old Hot Damn era shark bite shirt where the shark was biting the logo. And I was like, I don't know where she got it. I don't know if she even knows the band, but that's cool as shit. And the band, I saw it because the band tweeted it. Like, this is cool. Like, please get us in touch with her. And I was like, who is this? And then it turned out she was on TDE on Kendrick's label. And it was like, well, this is amazing. And then Control came out. And then, now she's SZA, who's about to play stadiums with Kendrick.
Mm-hmm.
But that was cool. And a bit Haley Williams-ish in the Ragga-Rama thrift store hardcore band shirt.
Speaking of old shirts and changing, I think we've touched on this a bunch, but I think even bringing in one quick vignette that we've somehow not mentioned really wraps it up for me and how I've ended up engaging with this record and how it has, unsurprisingly for an artist that's adjacent to me without you, has opened up my heart to something new in some way that I didn't expect or necessarily even really want to engage with, but here I am anyway. But I think my biggest takeaway, strangely enough, from this album of pretty straightforward pop music is how okay it is to change, and a reminder that I've gotten to where I've learned to trust this enough to tell other people, but it's hard for me to trust it enough for myself. If you're sincere, people will see it over time. You get really caught up in the moments where people read you wrong or think something different about you. But the older you get and the more you get used to changing in public, the more you notice that that's usually just people projecting on you, and you can keep moving in the way that you want to. And I think one example of how Paramore does that in a way that ties this really nice bow together, because it integrates modern artists who are taking what they've done and what they're doing and are doing their own thing with it, but also speaks to this 20 plus year evolution, like we've talked about, that we have quite a bit in common with them on. So the song Misery Business from Paramore's second record, in 2018, Paramore announced that they're not going to play that song anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that they're not going to play it, which we can easily say now, but we wouldn't have even had this phrase to use for it back then, is that there's basically internalized sexism in the song, which is, otherwise a pretty standard song at the time, to be honest, about a breakup and some other person is a bad person for helping your boyfriend cheat and all this stuff. But one of the lines from the song is, once a whore, you're nothing more. And like, even hearing it from my mouth just now, you probably went, well, that sure doesn't feel like it necessarily spiritually aligns with all of the good intention and vulnerability that we've talked about so far. And Paramore decided in 2018, like, we're not going to play this song anymore. And we're going to talk about that we're not going to play this song anymore. And here is why. Like, this is still our song.
Oh, by the way, still our biggest song.
Yeah, exactly. Like a huge recognizable song that people love. There are videos all over YouTube when they were still playing it where they would just invite people up on stage who could sing it line for line. Speaking of a community, like we mentioned, like, this was like a foundational song in that community. And yet they had a willingness as an artist and as a group to say, for better or worse, dude, this isn't us anymore. This is not who we want to be. We don't like it. And we're going to talk about it so that you know why we don't like it. And why we're not perpetuating this anymore. But one quote that I pulled specifically about this that just really encapsulated so much of what we're talking about was, quote, "But while Misery Business aims its venom at the girl that Haley Williams believes stole her boyfriend, Good for You by Olivia Rodrigo places blame on the dude who has moved on suspiciously easily." When Olivia Rodrigo sings, "Well, screw that and screw you, you will never have to hurt the way you know that I do," she's directly addressing the person who broke her heart, not creating collateral damage. End quote. Like, what a beautiful vignette of what it means to, like, as you've expressed so many times, Kyle, like talking about mental health and being vulnerable in public as a career artist who's been famous since before she was even an adult, along with the other people in this band, for them to have had that moment in their past, and instead of one, pretending it's not real, or two, like, and I don't mind making
deleting old tweets.
Yeah. Like pretending it never happened would be one option. Another band option, which I'd love to just poke fun in this moment, is like He Is Legend tried to pretend like 15 years that they didn't have a song called I Am Hollywood that we all loved.
And now they're doing a 3-year anniversary tour on the record.
You know what? And like, that's great. Like, it doesn't have to encapsulate everything you are in every moment. It was art that was made in a particular moment in time. But to see Paramore live out this moment specifically by saying, here is how we're going to change and you can come along with us, and having that change feel like it belongs with the environment that they've set up at their shows. Like, that's a vibe match. That's a frequency match. You can't do that unless you're intentionally being vulnerable and true to yourself over a really long period of time and evolving everywhere that you see the opportunity to do so. And only when you trust yourself to evolve like this can you get on the other end of it and have your own version of like an Olivia Rodrigo saying, well, you know what? I learned from you and you made me better. Like, your mistake in the way that you owned it and the way that you talked about it and grew helped me to grow and do something different the next time I came around to try to do basically this same thing, and have a song that yells about being angry, about being hurt, and being able to do that now without either being cheesy and pulling back from intense emotion, but also without saying something that you would go on to regret. That's literally growing up. And to see that evolution and be able to track that through a band and through music itself is, you know, a treasure. It's not something that we often get to see. And a lot of that is because we don't have bands like Paramore who have grown up along with and alongside us so often. And so I'm grateful that they exist.
I am too. And my hope for anyone who's made it this far in this episode is that, you know, they don't lean on the past, but they get what we have in Paramore and they use the past to look toward the future. One of the articles that I really wound up loving came from, I swear to God, Dork Magazine. And Ali Shuttler, he put it really beautifully. He said, there's also the fact that everything about Paramore feels so warm and empathetic in a world that seems to reward being heartless and selfish. Quoting Haley, that comes from realizing that there's really no surviving without each other. That keeps me soft, says Haley, taking a deep breath. Man, when I'm really going through it, I can clam up and my shell gets real thick. Does that sound like anybody else in 2025? Now I'm learning so much, and it's not easy. I'm a quilt of every awful thing that I've ever experienced, seen, or done. And I think the only thing that keeps me from running from that and hiding away is knowing that there's no way through this world without staying open, she offers. It's hard sometimes, but connecting with other people makes it feel like there's some sort of a future.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win a free vinyl copy of the album we just covered. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter for even more info about the album, including playlists, links to interesting articles and videos, and even some stories that didn't make the episode. Most importantly, though, please support your favorite local record store or concert venue, or buy merch from a band you love. Thanks for listening.